Hello, and thank you for visiting Listen. The sun went down just like it usually does, painting the jagged mountains in shades of crimson and gold, which was done in the cobble melancholy game. Even though it seemed as if the ground itself was bleeding for the lives that were lost, I saw it from the rooftop of our complex the night before. My regimen consisted of spending 5 minutes alone for 5 minutes away from the team, and they didn't mind Butch being Butch. Everything went to bad. I needed that stillness, even if it couldn't drown out the ghosts of previous missions that my troops had been on, but they would suggest that I should just brush it off. That evening, we were in a good mood, and Ryan was showing us images of his baby daughter, who had been born only 3 weeks before. She has my absolute heart. The poor youngster Jack and Noah were bickering over some stupid movie that they had viewed on a pirated DVD. He chuckled heartily at their argument. I can still vividly recall the manner in which they chuckled at the sound of echoes in my head as Doc was sitting in the corner penning a letter to his wife. As a sharp contrast to the cries that came less than 24 hours later, the mission was straightforward and routine because it was too straightforward. The purpose of the sweep was to get intelligence on a high-value target that was hiding in a town that we had struck a dozen times before I should have looked. The signs, the manner in which the residents dispersed earlier than normal, and the lack of children playing soccer in the dust, in spite of the fact that we were. A sense of complacency had crept in like a thief, and in our line of business, complacency is a death sentence. We were weary of being complacent. There was an improvised explosive device, IED, stashed behind a heap of garbage when the first explosion blasted through the air halfway across the settlement. Both Jack and Noah were killed quickly, and just as the dust was beginning to settle, shooting broke out. We fought back, of course, since it was a setup that came from every source, and we did it for sure. But they had the upper hand, the numbers, and the intelligence. They were aware of our path, our timings, and every movement that we made was accounted for. Using precision, Ryan moved around to the chest while pulling Jack to cover him. Doc continued to work on him even as he was in the middle of the process. His own leg was pierced by shrapnel, and he passed out standing next to Ryan, his hand still holding gauze that he had never had the opportunity to apply. I tried to recall when I was struck, but it was all a haze of smoke, noise, and agony. I went to the hospital. Down behind a crumb wall that was clutching my side to the point where blood was pouring out like a faucet, they abandoned me for dead. Recuperation wasn't an option. After spending many weeks in a hospital bed that was clean, the wounds that were on my body healed more quickly than the scars that were on my psyche. Replaying each and every choice and move, wondering what I might have done better, and experiencing what survivors term survivor's guilt. On the day that I was released from my position, I submitted my resignation. I didn't need a fancy word to realize that I was at my breaking point. My coworker brought me into his office and said all the right things, including that you are a hero, Butch, you've still refused to let me go. The army attempted to keep me. What they didn't realize was that I couldn't bear the thought of going back into the field without my brothers at this point in time. I have a lot to contribute. Now that I'm back in the United States, the world seems foreign to me, the streets are too calm, and the people are too unaware. I've exchanged desert for the city. The sound of gunfire was substituted with the buzz of a pickup truck engine, and I exchanged my fatigues for a pair of jeans and a flannel shirt. I just purchased a tiny home in the hills, far away from the bustle of the city. At night, I make myself comfortable on the porch and marvel at the stars. While I am searching for the stars that we saw in Afghanistan, I sometimes have the impression that I can hear their voices, Ryan's chuckle, and Jack's banter. Directions for the .com, but they are only memories that are in the process of fading away. I am tormented. A few of weeks ago, I was killed by the stillness, but it's not by ghosts. It's the silence that kills me. I discovered an old photograph in my bag that showed the whole squad smiling like morons with arms. I gazed at it for hours, trying to come to terms with what I was seeing. It was thrown over each other, and dirt was smeared on our faces. Its photograph was buried in the hills behind my home, and I planted a tree on top of it. I don't know why I did it, maybe I simply wanted to forget about it. Need something to sprout from all of this death, they say, and maybe it does, but for me, it's less about living than it is about growing. And more about living one day at a time, because that is what they would want, since it is all I know I was finally able to come to terms with. Despite the fact that I was at home, I was experiencing a great deal of melancholy as I traveled. Then one day, everything changed in an instant because of the coffee. Despite the fact that it was painfully bitter and burned, I drank it since it was hot and it kept my hands occupied. In any case, the cafe was one of those places that had furnishings that did not match and pricey pastries, the sort that made you question why you were there. I came here because it was peaceful, the type of calm that seemed doable, and I sat in the corner facing the wall. I want to know why you troubled me. Old habits die hard, the world outside has carried on without me, people are shuffling past laughing, and they are living than they are. Strolled in 3 of them, and you could tell that something was wrong immediately away because of the way that they surveyed the room with their eyes darting about. I've seen guys like them before, predators, they walked with purpose. To corners, who was calculating that they weren't come for coffee. I followed their gaze to the target, where there was a guy in his 60s with graying hair and a fine suit. It was like a pack closing in on its victim. While he was seated peacefully at a table near the window, he was not alone. 2 men surrounded him, and they were bodyguards. Big Burly was on the other side of them. With their earpieces tucked beneath their collars, the 3 guys were vigilant, but not enough so. They did not hesitate before firing the first shot. The delicate serenity of the cafe was broken, and all of a sudden, the world changed into mayhem. The bodyguards rushed quickly and drew their firearms. However, the second shot was not quick enough, and it caused the person on the left to fall to the ground. Blood splattered over the table, and the other one attacked. When he was attempting to shield the elderly guy from the bullet that hit his chest, the second bodyguard's weapon hit the floor and slipped to the ground. From the tiles in my direction, time slowed down, and I heard screaming and chairs scrapping against one another. When people were frantically trying to find shelter, the 3 shooters' advanced pistols were brought to the floor. As I was aiming at the elderly guy, I saw that the gun was laying only a few feet away from my boot. I was surprised that the first shot was successful. Against my better judgment, I grabbed the gun and fired. The recoil was familiar, and the bullet struck the person who was leading the charge in the chest. He fell to the ground like a bag of bricks, his pistol clattering on the ground. The second guy's eyes widened in amazement as he saw what had happened. He hesitated for a little while, which allowed me to insert a bullet between his ribs. The third one was more astute, he dove behind a table and used bullets. He used it as a cover as he shot wildly in my way, splinters flew as the chip burst near my head, and I dropped it. While I was going around the counter, my pulse was pounding, and the adrenaline was harsh and icy. On the other hand, my hands were solid, it was just like the time when muscle memory took over. I emerged from behind the bar and... When he was shot twice, the first ball missed a hole in the wall behind him, and the second shot struck his shoulder, which caused him to whirl around. As he collapsed to the ground and screamed, his pistol fell out of his fingers and slid away horizontally. The air was thick with the odor of gunpowder, and I stood there in quiet. The fragrance was accurate and heavy. I continued to keep my finger on the trigger of the revolver until I realized that there was no one else there to kill the elderly guy who was still alive. Alone, he peered at me with an expression that was inscrutable, as the bodyguard he had left on the floor began to bleed out. As they emerged from hiding behind tables, their eyes were filled with terror and appreciation. Someone murmured, "He saved us," but I didn't know it. The letter still seemed heavier than it should have, like the weight of all the things that were going on in the world. I felt like a hero. My ears rang. My chest tightened. I had already sacrificed lives, and at that same time, the elderly guy finally spoke. His voice was calm and measured, and you all had to listen carefully. I didn't respond to his question, but he stood there adjusting his jacket as if he hadn't just survived an attempt on his life. "Yes, you are aware of who I am." I remarked that my voice was really excellent. He nodded, "But I am aware of who I am. Who you are, and I owe you my life." I didn't want his appreciation, I didn't want anything else, all I just wanted was to be with you. Leaving to go back into the shadows, where I belonged, but something told me that wasn't going to happen when the time came for me to really depart. I was still there when the cops came, with the weapon laying on the table in front of me and my hands resting next to it. The elderly guy was still there. Of course, they vouched for me and declared that I acted in self-defense, which saved the lives of innocent people. Despite the fact that the police let me leave with a warning against vigilantism, the remarks of the elderly guy continued to remain in my mind as I left that cafe. It wasn't simply my name that he was referring to, he saw the soldier in me, the one that I had believed I had buried. "Mind, I know who you are." I was attempting to enjoy the peaceful morning when I received a call early on. I nearly didn't answer it, but something about the call made me think about it. I was informed by the number that the person on the other end of the line was neither a telemarketer or an old friend checking in on Mr. Foster from the voice. "I'd want you to come down to the station, Chief Noah, and I'd like to say that it wasn't a request that you make." I stated calmly and clipped this. My expectations were not met when I visited Rhodes' office. There was no polished mahogany desk or framed commendations, rather, it was a messy area. Despite the fact that papers was strewn on every surface and a coffee cup was tarnished from years of usage, RHS himself was a huge guy. "Take a seat, you are in your mid-50s, and you have a strong jawline and weary eyes that have seen too much." I sat there because you know why, he added, pointing to the chair that was directly across from his desk. "I had no clue that you were here." I folded my arms and leaned back, looking at me as if I were a stranger. He was at a loss for how to unravel the mystery of the elderly guy you had rescued the day before. "His name is David," and the name struck him like a ton of bricks. I had heard of David Rhodes, and anybody who had spent enough time on this side of the law would know that he wasn't simply doing what he was supposed to do. He was the mafia leader, a ghost with a suit and a grin that was difficult to forget. He was the mob boss. Noah heaved a sigh as the police officers began to mutter his name with a mixture of dread and irritation. The last thing I anticipated for a long was for him to massage his temples. "Hek, my brother," of all the things he could have said, that was the last thing I expected. "David and I don't see eye to eye." I simply sat there staring at the heavy quiet till he eventually broke it. "Sight," Ethan remarked, "I haven't been able to do that for years. I've spent the majority of my career trying to put him behind bars wherever I get close to him. He uses the absence of proof, witnesses who vanish, juries who are too afraid to condemn him, and whatever else you can think of. I didn't mention it. Whatever it is, what could I possibly say?" But now he proceeded, "You've altered the game in what way?" Noah spoke those words with a tone that was loaded with significance. David is not one to allow things like that go unnoticed since he is an old-school person. He will have the impression that he owes you, and you can be sure that he will make an effort to return that obligation by providing him with money, favors, and maybe even a job that I moved in my life. The weight of his comments began to settle in on me. "I don't want his money or his favors," I remarked, and Noah responded by saying that I had found out that I was right. "In light of this, I would like to provide you with an additional opportunity." He leaned forward, laying his arms on the desk, and joined the department. I was taken aback by his statement that you are a soldier. His voice was forceful. "You've been caught off guard. Has the capacity to manage problems that the majority of people would avoid, and with David, we have the abilities, the discipline, and the instinct to do so. It's going to be necessary for you to have allies, and I can assure you of that." I glanced at him, trying to determine his perspective on why I should be there. "In light of the fact that you have already created an adversary of the sort of individuals I have spent my whole life fighting," Noah remarked, "and regardless of whether you You now find yourself in the center of this situation, whether you like it or not. You have rescued David, but you did not join his world, which makes you a reanger. Before continuing, he gave it some time to sink in. David could attempt to lure you in, but if you say no, he won't simply let you walk away. I was sitting there evaluating my alternatives when I decided to join the department, which provides you with safety and a purpose. I did not give up without a struggle. To put on a badge was a notion that did not sit well with me since I was not a police officer, and to be honest, I wasn't even sure that I was a soldier anymore. However, Noah was not incorrect. David RHS would not forget about me, and the last thing I wanted was a mafia leader breathing on my neck. I questioned Noah's jaw. What happens if I say no? Next, still joining the police seemed like exchanging one conflict for another. What happens if I say something? If you are tightened, then you are on your own. I left his office without providing him with a response. The streets seemed different as I passed through them. Returning to my vehicle with a larger load, the options that were presented to me were not very appealing. I aligned myself with the law, and I got drawn into Noah's conflict with his brother, or else there is a possibility that David's appreciation may develop into something far more. It was obvious that my mornings of silent, bitter coffee were ended, and for good. Reandrous, one thing was plain. The knock on my door was not anticipated by the time I opened it, which was the first time in years that I was uncertain about what my next step would be. I had already known who would be standing there when I reached for it, because no one else knocks on that door in such a subdued and careful manner. Especially after a day like I'd had, I opened it to discover David looking as sharp as usual, his fitted suit seeming out of place. "Mr. Foster," he added in a manner that was soothing and disarming, "please place me on my worn front porch." I hope I'm not invading, since he wasn't alone himself when he was purring like a lion before it pounces. Behind him was a younger guy in his early 30s who was tall, athletic, and had the same crisp muscles as him. Characteristics and penetrating eyes like David, his son. He held a leather bag in one hand casually as if it were his gym bag. This was without a doubt the case. In the evening, I indicated that I would move aside and come in, and they didn't squander any of my investment. During the time that David was sitting at my kitchen table, the atmosphere surrounding him demanded attention, and his son Alistair thoughtfully put the bag on the table. "I heard you have a chat with my brother today." I was standing by his father's shoulder, watching and being mute. "I heard you had a talk with him." I did not respond. Instead, I just observed David as he proceeded to elegantly fold his hands. He proceeded to wave his hand as if to reject the concept, and I am aware that there is no need to explain it. Despite the fact that Noah has good intentions, his method is, to put it mildly, a little bit off base. "It is obvious that you are a man of principle, which is the reason I am here," he said with a gesture to the individual who unzipped the bag and leaned it forward. David replied that he would simply want to join us and let me view the piles of cash that were inside the $250,000. I didn't even look at the money, and you probably assume I'm going to accept a bribe. I begged my voice to be flat. "There will be more to come if you prove yourself." "Leaning back, an opportunity you've seen, Mr. Foster," David added, making it clear that it was not a bribe. "This is how the world works. Guys like my brother wear badges, yet their hands are just as filthy as everyone else's. I have something to give." I was not interested in the new power, independence, and allegiance that I was experiencing. I shook my head. Alice eventually replied, his voice being more subdued than I had anticipated but still forceful. "Butch, you should give it some thought, since it's not only about. It's not about the money, it's about respecting family." I'll say it again, the word comes out tasting bitter. David grinned. "Mr. Foster, I want you to know that I admire your slow knowing grin since you've gone through hell. I must say that I respect your choice, regardless of what it may be, but I would be irresponsible if I did not make this offer." I stood with my back against the wall. Seated in the chair, maintaining a steady stare, I assured Noah that I would be joining the department. Not be flawless, but at least he's trying to do what's right. I won't be your soldier, David, for a minute. The time he's battling to do what's right. After the room had become silent, David stood there, straightening his jacket with a move that he had perfected. "Butch, you are a brave man," he remarked. "I knew that the moment I saw you handle those men, and I respect bravery above all else," he said with a tone that was almost adoring. Extended his hand, and after a few while, I grabbed it. His hold was firm and uncompromising. He continued in a low voice, "If you ever change your mind, you know where to find me and I will be waiting for you. Don't be afraid to give me a call if you ever find yourself in need of genuine assistance, I'll be there for you." A list came up next to his handshake war. "You made your decision," he continued with a faint grin pulling at the corner of his lips, "and I accept that. His choice was warmer than his father's. Despite the fact that we are on opposing sides, you have the heart of a brother. Don't be a stranger, Butch." He looked to the bag of money, zipping it shut without a sign of disappointment. It was all a game to them, an offer made and declined with no hard feelings and no attempt to make a deal. When they were leaving, David lingered at the doorway, and they did not display any sentiments, at least not any. While looking back over his shoulder, "Mr. Foster," he reminded himself to take care of himself. "This world needs guys like you, regardless of whatever side you are on." I remained there for a long, gazing at the door despite the fact that you were on the door and it was closed behind them, leaving me alone in the stillness. There was a lot that might have been purchased at the location where the bag of cash had been worth $250,000. Time, comfort, and maybe even serenity, but none of those things would have been able to buy my soul, David, and I could see that Alistair meant what they said, but I also knew that their allegiance came with a price that I was not ready to pay. I drew my own conclusions. While I was pouring myself a drink of water, I was thinking about the line in the sand, and I had no illusions about how difficult it would be to keep it steady. As I sat back at the table and drank whiskey, one thought kept going through my head: the conflict was not ended, it had simply shifted. Front's life in the force was not what I had anticipated. I swapped my fatigues for a batch, and although the rhythm was different, I traded my fatigues for a batch. There was no change in the stakes, each day presented a new obstacle, and each call was a risk. Nonetheless, I wasn't in it for the long haul. I was in it to find meaning, maybe even redemption, and that's how I found myself at the site of an accident. I was no longer looking for adrenaline at this time. It was a wet evening when I received the report that a vehicle had gone off the road and skittered down an embankment. I was winding up my shift at the opportunity. I was driving when I crashed into a tree, and by the time I arrived, the rain was pouring down relentlessly, turning the roadside into a waterlogged mess. There was a lady inside the vehicle who was asleep but breathing out her face. The automobile was crushed, and the hood had folded in on itself like an accordion. She was covered in blood from a cut on her forehead, and I introduced myself as Officer Foster at that moment. At the same time that I was working to remove her from the debris, I was attempting to keep her voice calm. "I'm getting you out of here," she murmured. While she was moaning somewhat and her eyelids were fluttering open, her beauty hit me even at that time. Her features were gentle, and her hair was black. Despite the fact that she seemed to be in a level of strength that was not indicative of her actual condition, the paramedics came just as I was able to free her. They rushed her to the hospital, and I stayed behind to make sure that she was in a stable condition and that all of her administrative documentation was in order. Something about her lingered with me when I eventually saw her awake in the hospital bed, bandaged, even if it wasn't as per procedure as it should have been. When she was conscious, she flashed me a feeble grin and thanked me for saving her life. Her voice was gentle. My response was, but steady, "Just doing my job," she continued with a tiny giggle. "I'm just taking care of my job." I was feeling a tug that I hadn't felt in a long time, and I remarked to Emily, "It's nice to meet you, Emily." I went to check on her a few days after she was released from the hospital, and she expressed gratitude and astonishment that I had gone out of my way to do so. Of my way, we engaged in conversation for a bit, and before I realized it, the words were out, "Would you be interested in getting coffee at some point in the future?" She paused for a period of time before smiling and said, "I'd like that." One day turned into two. Then, 3 weeks went by in a haze and were filled with late-night chats, shared meals, and the type of laughing that I hadn't experienced before. Emily had a way of making things seem lighter and simpler, and I eventually realized that I had been missing her. The fact that she moved in a few months later was not something I had intended on happening, but it seemed like the world wasn't such a gloomy place after all. Just occurred as a natural occurrence, just like everything else that occurred with her, my peaceful home that was previously filled solely with echoes and the manner of recollections. I immediately felt like I was alive, and we would sit on the sofa together at night, with her head resting on my shoulder, and we would chat about different things. I was questioned about my time spent in the army, specifically about the scars I carried at the time, both those that were visible and those that were not visible. Noah has never phoned me before, but I wanted to tell her everything for the first time in a very long time. I haven't told her anything yet. I would not go into his office unless it was a serious matter, so when I heard my name crackle over the intercom of the precinct that afternoon, I felt a sense of comfort. A knot began to grow in my stomach, and I knocked twice before walking inside. Noah was standing behind his desk with his arms folded. "Close the door, Butch," he replied with a firm voice, but his look was a mixture of curiosity and something that was more difficult to nail down. The weight of his tone hanging thick in the air, I obeyed with the firmness of his tone. "Take a seat." Foster Noah started to lean back with his elbows and stated, "You're doing a good job here," while referring to the chair that was directly opposite from him. Eyes looking at me. "I have faith in you, which is why I have a question for you that is not on record." I tapped on your shoulder but nodded. "Why do you trust me?" What took me off guard was the inquiry, "Are you living with Emily Carter?" My first reaction was to defend her, but something prevented me from doing so. Noah groaned and rubbed his temple as he said that his tone caused me to halt because I adore her. I stated this while maintaining a steady stare of mine own. "Sorry, that wasn't what I meant." "Do you know who she is?" I frowned in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Addressing Emily Carter, he spoke carefully, as if he was contemplating each word, and he said, "Emily, here I am." For a little period, the rooms seemed to tilt, and I had the sensation that I had been struck by one of those grenades that I used to avoid accidentally picking up. In a low voice, I murmured, "It's not possible that you're still standing after being blown back overseas." She uses her mother's last name, most likely to separate herself from her father. Noah moved forward, his eyes piercing. "David is her father. I left his workplace a few days ago, but she is one of them. Butch, she is not a mistake under any circumstances." My thoughts were racing with questions by the time I arrived home that evening, and Noah's comments were playing over and over in my head. Emily was in the room. While she was preparing supper, she turned around and smiled when she spotted me. "Hey," she said as she walked over to kiss me. "The kitchen is humming softly." It was me, but I took a step back, and the grin that had been on her face disappeared. "What's wrong? Did you not tell me that I questioned you with a tone that was more severe than I had intended? Why didn't you tell me who your father is? Where is her face?" She became pale, and for a brief time, she seemed to be a deer caught in headlights. After that, her shoulders continued to drop, and she slowly nodded her head. "I was going to tell you," she said, "but I didn't know how to do it, and then things happened." It was as if she had been anticipating just this time. "You lied to me, Emily, and I said that the betrayal would alter everything. It grew so serious between us, and I was afraid that it would change everything." She said, "I trusted you, and I didn't lie." This was a more profound admission than I intended to make. "I simply didn't tell you because it doesn't matter, Butch. I'm not a part of that life. I'm not participating in that life. I'm not a part of that life. I left when I was 18 years old, and ever since she sat down at the table, I haven't looked back. Do you have any idea what it was like to grow up in that home and see my father influence me? I have my hands gripped firmly together. Everyone around him, even my brother, looked up to him as if he were some sort of king, and I detested it. I detested both him and the people surrounding him. I left her voice broken the minute I was old enough, and I saw the agony in her eyes right then and there. David is the name of my mother because I have spent every day striving to be my own person and leave that name behind. This is the reason why I use my mother's name. Not only does RHS not define me, but I also sat down opposite her, my wrath gradually becoming into anything that is more in line with understanding why you didn't tell me earlier, because I didn't want you to look at me in the same way that you do yourself. Are now, she replied, tears welling up in her eyes as if I were some sort of stranger. I'm a stranger for sure. Not him, Butch, I will never be him. The stillness that existed between us was depressing, but at long last. I extended my hand across the table and clasped her hands in mine. I believe you, Emily, but you ought to have had enough faith in me to tell me. I know that, she said, I'm sorry, and over the course of the subsequent several months, we managed to rebuild the. Despite the fact that her father had been a source of trust, Emily repeatedly demonstrated that she was not at all like him, and I came to the realization that whatever. It wasn't her fault that she carried around baggage, she was more resilient than she gave herself credit for, and loving her was the ultimate reward. That was the simplest thing I'd ever done. 6 months later, we stood in front of a small gathering of friends and family, and Noah was there. When Emily said, I do, it wasn't simply a pledge, it was also incorporated in the context of our exchange of vows. Constituted a proclamation, a boundary that was established between her history and the future that we were constructing together, and for the very first time for a very long time, I had the impression that I had discovered a place where I genuinely belonged. The very first thing that you learn when you join the force is that chaos is inevitable. I wasn't the sort of person to wait for you to catch up, it strikes hard and quick, and it doesn't care whether you're ready. I wasn't the kind of guy to wait for you to catch up. It's possible that it was my time spent in the Green Berets, or it may have been just who I was at the time, but whatever, when things got tough, I hesitated. I was the one they branded violent, and every operation brought back memories of Afghanistan. The tension in the air was comparable to that of Afghanistan. Time appeared to slow down just before everything began to move, but now it seems to be moving at a much faster pace. Rather of being hostile warriors, it was armed thieves, members of gangs, or individuals who were desperate and had nothing to lose. In addition, instead of when we received a call about a hostage one night, it was my fellow policemen who were depending on me to keep them safe. They were my brothers in arms. When we arrived at the convenience store, there was a scenario in which a man was already strung up on something and had a cashier and 2 customers at gunpoint. As soon as they arrived, the street was already crowded with police vehicles and people who were standing by, in a state of fear. Sergeant Carter remarked, "Foster, you're up." As I nodded toward the structure, I reached for a ballistic shield in my sidearm. My mind was already calculating the angles at which the exits would be located. When I neared the business, I could hear the man yelling with a voice that was a mixture of fury and terror. The various reangers that may be encountered. As I peered through the glass door, I saw that guy was walking about while swinging the rifle around as if it were an extension of his arm. "Hey," I announced my presence. "I am Officer Foster, and I am speaking in a firm and loud voice." His eyes are fixed on me in a frenzied manner. He yelled out with the rifle shaking in his grasp, "I'm not coming," and he was erratic. "I'm not coming." I replied that I would keep my tone cool, "But you don't want to do this, so let's work this out together, all right?" "Any closer?" I said. In the course of my conversation with him, the minutes turned into what seemed like hours. I made sure to keep my motions leisurely and my remarks thoughtful. As I moved in to secure the situation, I continued to chip away at his defenses until he eventually downed the pistol. At the same time, the hostages rushed out. When he was taken into jail, another crisis was avoided, and another life was spared. However, not every scenario was resolved the same way. One day, we were confronted with a situation in which violence was the only language that the perpetrator knew, and I was required to speak it fluently. An individual who had a history of violence had locked himself inside his home with his family when the police were called to a domestic incident. I was armed with a knife and ready to murder Wildy when we broke through the door with my wife and children. When the negotiations failed, we broke through the door. The first one through, and in the brief second that he rushed on me, I reacted by disarming him and bringing him under control before anybody else was wounded. The rush of excitement struck me like a freight train, but as I glanced at the scared expressions on his family's faces, I realized that I was in re-anger. It was clear to me that it was a worthwhile endeavor because word rapidly traveled about how I conducted myself in the field, and officers began looking to me. There were times when things went awry, and believing myself to be the calm in the storm was not something I actively sought for, but I was unable to find it. If I choose to disregard the responsibilities, then citizens will also start to recognize me. It might have been a mother expressing gratitude to me for rescuing her kid, or it could have been a shop owner shaking my hand after I had prevented a robbery. Gratitude served as a reminder of the reasons I made this decision, but there were times when the burden of everything seemed to be too much to bear. Night after night, when I would get home with my knuckles hurting and my head racing, Emily would be waiting for me, but she never asked me about it. She did not press inquiries, rather, she just sat with me, her presence serving as a reminder that I was not alone. The work was challenging, but I was not alone. I was seeking for something simple, I was looking for a reason to make my history into something that mattered, and every time I looked for it, I found it. Every time I brought someone home alive, I felt as if I was doing just that because in the end, I was the one who walked directly into the pandemonium. To put it simply, it was all about drawing a boundary between chaos and order and being steadfast when no one else could. The moment Emily informed me that she was expecting a child, I felt as if the earth under my feet moved in the midst of all the insanity that was my life. Rebuilding after the violence, I had never anticipated that I would be in this situation, the concept of bringing a kid. I felt a mixture of exhilaration and worry as I entered the realm of becoming a parent. The months that followed put me to the test in ways that I had never experienced before. Wasn't ready for the sudden and intense mood changes that Emily experienced, which came on like a storm moving in. Suddenly, without any prior notice, she was smiling, her hands were holding her tummy, and she was discussing potential names for her baby a moment later. After that, she would get enraged about something as little as my forgetting to replace the cap on the toothpaste. At first, I attempted to calm her down. In an attempt to argue with her and explain myself, but it just made matters worse, so I learned from my mistakes. In order to put up with her and allow her to vent without taking it personally, there were times when she would sit on the sofa and weep over a commercial or a movie. Whenever there was a sad part in a movie, I would sit next to her and reassure her by holding her hand. Some nights, she would strike out at me, labeling me obstinate or frigid because I didn't react the way she expected me to. Other nights, everything would be okay. During the evening, after I had returned home late after a shift, she yelled out, "I care more than you know I care about you." She wanted you to not care about her. I was able to maintain my voice even when I was completely exhausted, but this work does not allow me to do that. "I'm trying my best, Emily," and then she gave me a look for not waiting. "Neither do you, and neither do the kid." "I know," she said quietly, tears pooling in my eyes. She murmured after a time, her countenance softened. The look in her eyes, I feel like I'm going crazy. I drew her into my arms and kissed the forehead of her head. The top of her head. "You are not, you are just holding our whole universe inside of you." As the months went by, I became an expert in. As I was juggling everything, I dealt with risky circumstances and violent calls at work, and then I went home to assist Emily with all she needed. Building a crib every moment seemed like a balancing act, but I didn't let it get to me. I needed to go to doctor's visits late at night. I had cravings. My thoughts was cloudy, but this was my family on the night that it occurred. I had just finished working a double shift, and my feet were hurting at the same time. The moment I caught sight of Emily clenching her stomach, I was jolted awake. It is time for her to. I grabbed the hospital bag that we had packed several weeks ago and assisted her in getting to the car, she added with a voice that was shaking but resolute. The trip was like a haze, half frenzied and half unreal, and Emily was deep in thought at the same time. She was standing next to me, holding my hand so firmly that I was afraid she would break it. When we arrived at the hospital, it was like walking on a stone. I was thrust into a conflict zone, but this time the stakes were bigger than anything I had ever experienced before. The nurses and physicians worked with precision as they led Emily into a room, and as I was trying to remain calm, she said over my shoulder, "Stay with me. I'm not going away, I promised," she said with a strain in her voice as she held her hand by her side as the contractions came and went like. Emily yelled, swore, and wailed as she watched the waves smash against the shoreline. The hours passed, each one dragging slower than the one before it. I held her hand through all she was going through, cleaned her forehead with a cold towel, offered encouragement, and wiped her forehead. From the moment she crushed my fingers until the moment when I finally heard the sound I'd been waiting for. Looking forward to a tear that is both little and penetrating, which will break through the tension in the room. Before putting the baby in the incubator, the doctor announced, "It's a girl." He was holding up the wiggling infant. When she was crying on Emily's bosom, Emily's face was hot and she was fatigued, but her eyes were bright. She was overcome with unadulterated happiness as she gazed down at our baby. I stood there frozen for a time, completely overcome by the sight of her. The two of them together, Emily inquired with a voice that was kind and full of wonder, "Do you want to hold her?" "I am a little bit nervous, but maybe I'll try it." Afterwards, Emily was a little surprised, but she did not give it a lot of consideration. 2 days later, Emily and the baby returned home, and they were both surprised. The grandfather of Butch was already waiting for his granddaughter, and he was holding him in his hands. After a few minutes of staring at him, he was ready to go. After that, he returned the baby to Emily, and my father Mike cornered me. "Sheck, she is really stunning." The tone of his voice was pleasant at first, but then it changed to become more cautious. "Butch, are you there?" While I was certain that I was aware of all that he was saying, I did not answer to his question and instead beckoned for him to follow me into the corridor. When we were no more within hearing distance, I crossed my arms and rested against the wall. I confessed to my father that I had been asking him the same thing. Keeping my voice down ever since I saw the infant, I've had my reservations, but I didn't say anything since there was nothing to worry about other than myself. To say that until I find out the specifics of this situation, I was a fool to trust her. Mike's brow wrinkled, his jaw becoming tighter, and now I am saying that I took a quick look out the window, which overlooked the parking lot, and collected my thoughts. Now, I will confess that the hour is not ideal, and the baby, she does not look like me at all, but I have been keeping silent about it since I wanted to see her first in order to. I want to look into it because I don't want to hastily draw judgments that may cause my family to fall apart without any evidence. Mike nodded slowly. There was a mixture of worry and understanding on his face, and Emily, has she said anything that would lead you to believe that I shook my head? Despite the fact that she has been acting as if nothing is wrong, I will find out if there is anything that she is concealing since I have been down too many times. Impossible to ignore my instinct, but I need to proceed with caution since if I approach her without evidence, it might blow up in my face. And I'm not going to abandon this little child without first gaining an understanding of the facts. Mike looked at me for a brief minute before leaving. Face softening. "You are a fine man, Butch. A lesser person would have lost it by now." I grinned bitterly, being patient. I was trying to understand what you were saying. "I have learned to keep my feelings in check, but that does not mean that I am not upset with you, Dad. If there is treachery here, it stings deep." My father put his hand on my shoulder and said, you deserve the truth, son, whatever it is. I think you should check at least till the moment is appropriate. I mentioned that my jaw was clenching in one direction or another, and you'll manage it, as you usually do. Another I'll get to the bottom of it. As I stepped back into the room, Emily awoke slightly in her bed and looked up at me with a sleepy expression on her face. Although I was trying to keep my feelings in check for the time being, I managed to muster up a grin. Even while the path that lay ahead was unclear, one thing was certain: would not allow anybody, regardless of how close they were, to get away with lying. Regardless of whether or not my suspicions were correct, I felt that I owed it to both myself and to my daughter to find out the truth. I stood in the way of discovery. As I lay out the scenario in Noah's office, the dark light formed long shadows, and every word I spoke felt sour in my tongue. However, I continued to go through everything. No matter how hard I tried, I was unable to contain my emotions any longer. We were discussing my wife, my kid, and the faith that Noah placed in me. As he sat back in his chair, his fingers were intertwined in front of him, and he began to listen. He did not interrupt, although he did periodically nod his head. After I had done, there was a moment of silence in the room. "You are certain about this?" he eventually questioned in a tone that was low but steady. "I don't know. I have recognized that my jaw is tight, but I can't ignore the indicators that I need answers. I want clarification." As Noah grumbled and ran an errand, he said, "Nate, for my own sanity, for that little girl in the crib. Okay, we'll do this the way it's supposed to be done, no shortcuts, no bending," with his hand over his face. "In accordance with the law, if Emily is concealing anything, we will discover it, but you and I are not going to cross any boundaries," I stated without hesitation. A team consisting of Selena Diaz and Noah had been assembled within an hour after Noah's reluctance. Although she was the first person to arrive, tough as nails, a former Marine who had transitioned into a detective, she strolled into the room as if she owned it. After placing her piercing eyes on me and quietly evaluating me, she remarked, "You want my assistance, you've got it." The next person to speak plainly was Brian. He was youthful, a bit nervous, but smart when it came to surveillance and intelligence gathering. He was the department's tech wizard. "In the process of tracking, we will establish a clean net," he continued, adjusting his spectacles. "Unless she is a hacker, she won't detect anything happening." She was the last member of the squad, which consisted of two plainclothes policemen named Reed and Carmichael. Their task was to simply remain vigilant. I went out that afternoon and purchased everything I need for the audio recording of Emily's actions from a distance and report all of my findings. It seemed improper and intrusive to have recording devices, tiny video cameras, and a phone tracker of any kind. Even so, I forced myself to ignore the guilt. This wasn't about having control or being paranoid, rather, it was about discovering the truth that night. While Emily was sleeping, I set up the devices, which included a recorder below the television, a small camera in the living room, and a camera in the kitchen. I installed a tracker on her phone and made sure that it would transmit real-time information to Brian's phone. I did this on the dashboard of her automobile. Every action seemed like a betrayal, but the alternative was far more terrible. The next morning, I had a meeting with the team on the secure server. Noah, who was sitting at the head of the table in the tiny conference room at the station, stated, "It's all right," with a serious look on his face. I would want to remind everyone that this is not a usual situation, but the stakes are high. Butch deserves answers, and we are going to get them. As for you, Selena, you are on coordination. Brian, keep an eye on the streams and report anything that seems out of the ordinary. Reed Carmichael, you are on foot. Let the observation remain undetected, but refrain from touching anything until we have anything concrete. Despite the fact that it went against every instinct I had, I nodded. I had assumed that Butch would obtain DNA from the kid, and that was all that was involved. Is expected from you at this very time. I felt the weight of the operation crushing down on me. As the days passed, I proceeded to seek medical attention. I went to work, took care of my responsibilities, and then returned home to Emily and the baby. I pretended that nothing was wrong, but whenever I saw her grin or laugh, I knew something was amiss. When I heard her laugh, I couldn't help but wonder whether those laughs were real or if she was just acting out a character to conceal something under the surface. Emily went about her normal routine of food shopping for the first few days of monitoring, during which there was not much evidence produced. It seemed as if everything was going according to plan, including going to the park with the baby and conducting errands, but then Brian contacted me one afternoon. As I drove to the precinct, my stomach nodded in agreement, and my mind was spinning with thoughts of the situation. "Butch, you are going to want to see this." Possibilities. When I entered the conference room, Brian was working on his laptop, while Selena and Noah were standing behind him. I inquired with a tone that was more abrasive than I had meant, and Brian pressed the play button on a video stream that was coming from the living room. "She looked just like you, darling," and there was a pause before she said, "I don't know." Camera Emily was on the phone, and her voice was soft but clear. I was staring at the television with my hands that were clenched, but Butch has no idea what he is doing. At my sides I questioned Brian, who was she talking to, and he shook his head, saying that he had no idea yet. On the other hand, the numbers that were highlighted in the system belonged to a person called Alex Brown. Noah came forward before his expression. I bowed my head in agreement. "Grim, this does not prove anything, Butch, not yet, but it is a start." As I was leaving the room, I felt a rush of excitement rushing through my thoughts. I wanted to know everything. If I were to let a chilly determination take hold of me, I would find out the truth in some way or another. When Brian entered the room, I could tell by the expression on his face that he had discovered something, even if it was destructive to all I believed I understood. Something that he didn't say at first. He simply sat down and opened his laptop, and the screen shone in the faint light. It was the light of the precinct office, and he motioned for me to come closer. "Let's make this quick," he remarked with a hard voice. I drew up a chair and tried to prepare myself for what was about to happen. For the days that I had been living with, I was sure that you were not going to enjoy it. The growing sense that Emily was concealing something, and now that the moment of truth had arrived, Brian began with the. I looked over everything, including the locations, the CCTV video, her emails, and her message. There is no way to ignore the fact that everything cross-referenced it with Brown's known travels and sites that he has gone on several occasions. That number struck me like a blow to the belly, and my mind whirled as it replayed every single one of those 2 years ago. They had been meeting for 2 years. My recollection of Emily over that period of time, including the subtle shifts in her demeanor, the odd late hours spent working, and the infrequent. I had dismissed the justifications as being harmless, and Brian resumed his tone clinically as normal. According to what I can gather, he was presenting a report, and it wasn't some grand love affair, rather, it was physical texting between the two of them. At most cases, they are organizing rendezvous at hotels, and there is no emotional link between them. When I was just having sex, I tightened my teeth and forced myself to remain calm. I was angry. In spite of the fact that treachery was seething under the surface, I couldn't allow it to take control just yet since she didn't mention you very much. In spite of the fact that his voice faltered as if he knew it would, Brian continued, "This wasn't about replacing you, it was about." Another thing I did was lean back in the chair and clench my fists until my knuckles became white. It had been 2 years since I had taken that action. I questioned Brian in a calm and controlled voice. "Of lies, where did they meet?" Brian clicked his tongue. Through a few tabs, bringing up maps and video of hotels, and with the majority of his visits occurring at his apartment. Nevertheless, she was very cautious during work hours and was often out from town. Watched the blurry film of Emily heading into a hotel lobby while staring at the television. Her face was serene and poised as she was about to enter the lobby. She had nothing to conceal, and Brian had delivered me the tape with a look that said that he hoped he didn't have to do what he did. I didn't say much. I simply shoved the USB stick over the desk and murmured, "You're going to want to sit down while I'm going to explain this." I brought it home, locking myself in the vehicle that was parked in the driveway, and then I plugged it into the portable player that I maintained for my career. As I pressed the play button, my heart was hammering, and my fingers were twitching. The audio began with static, and then it was followed by her voice. The voice of Emily was so kind and lovely that I could have picked it out of a crowd in a second. It was the same voice that had spoken those words. She remarked, "Promises of forever," to me hewn completely in the dark, with a light giggle, and the sound was piercing and biting. Then, Alex's voice came in, deep and arrogant, and casual. "You sure he doesn't have any idea what he's talking about?" I thought laughing could never be so deep. "It's not that he's an idiot, he's a police officer." Emily laughed once again, and I couldn't help but chuckle. I had such a firm hold on the steering wheel that I was afraid it may break. "No, he is not, but at the same time, he is too trusting and wants to." I let him believe in me, and my gut wrenched. Alex reacted with a giggle. "I let him believe in me. You are really excellent at it, and you have always been there." There was a lull, and I could hear the faint sound of glasses clinking. "I see them seated there. Do you ever feel guilty about the fact that you were together and content, as if nothing they were saying was causing someone else's life to be destroyed?" Alex inquired, almost in a playful manner, about what she responded, which led him to believe that the child is. Emily's voice may be heard as he watches him care over you and dole out affection like a lovesick dog. Lowered to a whisper, but it still seemed like a scream in my ears. "I mean, yes, he's nice, but it's just that he's not really that sweet." I found myself repeating the phrase, "easy this way, he's stable, he's safe," over and over in my thoughts. As soon as the bullet was fired, Alex laughed once again, "And he is going to bring up our child as well." Despite the fact that she was speaking in a light-hearted manner, Emily said that she would not consider the final Davide on the dumb cuck to be a Davide. Practically speaking, you don't want to be tied down, and I don't want to deal with his rage. This way, everyone is happy, and everyone is happy. After a moment of hesitation, Alex answered in a sarcastic tone, "Okay, maybe not everyone." She then laughed. "Nevertheless, it is effective, isn't it?" Alex let out a long sigh, evidently delighted by whatever that had happened. "In any other case, Emily, you have him wrapped around your finger." The tape came to a close with more laughing, and their voices faded into silence. While I sat there, the atmosphere in Noah's office was like the eye of the storm. It was quiet on the surface, but it was fraught with an unsaid tension. I am clenching my hands, maintaining a tight jaw, and every muscle in my body is begging to be released. The other members of the team were already there, and Selena Bryan and the two cops who had been following Emily Noah stood behind them. His arms were folded behind his desk, and his look was impenetrable. Bryan was the first to speak. "Alex will be at your home while you are on patrol, and he will be clearing his throat uncomfortably. They are intending to meet to discuss the matter tomorrow." The room was quiet for a brief period, and the weight of his words hung in the air like a weight on my blood. "I am certain that you will not be there." Despite the fact that my hands were trembling and I was gripping the very edge of my chair at home, I was able to. In order to convey that my voice was low and strained, Bryan nodded, and Emily sent him a text message. "By putting everything in order, she believes that everything will be secure safe." That dreadful word once again, my teeth pressed against one another, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. Noah then entered the room, and his speech was calm and relaxed. The tone of his voice pierced through the fog of fury that was clouding my mind. "Butch, listen to me. We are not going to let this go unchecked. We will address it, but we are going to do it in a wise way. We are not going to make choices on the spur of the moment." I nodded, even though my heart was pounding with the want to take action, and I believe that you heard me. If there was anybody who could assist me in channeling this fury into something useful, it was Noah. Noah went to him whenever he needed assistance. The rest of the team is working on putting up a strategy, and I need you, Brian, to keep track of everything that happens, including calls, messages, and movements. I would want Selena to organize the surveillance in the days running up to tomorrow. I would like to have eyes on the home before, during, and after Alex appears. He will put the remainder of you in standby position so that you are ready to move upon receiving the command. Butch, I know you want to tackle this alone, but you're not alone in this. We're all in this together. Butch glanced back at me with his eyes steady. You don't screw a police officer's wife and get away with it, and I'm going to make sure that both of them are aware of how serious of a mistake they've made. I didn't trust myself to talk, so I simply nodded again. My anger wasn't causing me to speak. Away safe. Not going away, but for the time being I am channeling it into the plan that they believed they might use to humiliate me in my own home tomorrow afternoon. After the day arrived, Alex Brown entered Butch's home, and the camera filmed the moment. At that moment, they realized how absolutely incorrect they had been. When Brian's alert came through my body, I was greeted by Emily, who was wearing black lingerie and giving him a kiss. My body was tense and coiled like a coil. As I drove up to my home, my pulse was pounding in my chest. It was springtime, and the moment had finally arrived. It was not out of fear that I entered, but rather out of the sheer controlled wrath that I had been keeping back ever since this nightmare started. I was in my bedroom when I heard voices and muffled noises coming from there. I was slowly moving the door open with a cautious slowness. As soon as I opened the door, I was confronted with the image of Emily and Alex, who had become the embodiment of every terrible dread I could have ever imagined. Something inside of me broke before Alex could even respond, and they were having sex on my bed as if they didn't give a damn about anything around them. As I slammed my fists on him, I felt an anger that I had not known I had been harboring throughout the months of treachery. He attempted to shield himself from the humiliation that was pouring out of every hit, but I wasn't giving him the opportunity you thought he was going to get. You may enter my home and carry out this action, I said, my voice reverberating off the walls of my home. My hand grabbed him by the collar and threw him into the dresser. His face was covered in blood, and his look changed from one of shock to one of shock. From cocky to afraid, I removed my handcuffs. My speech was calm and steady, and now you're laughing at me. Although being under arrest for sexually abusing my wife, Emily grabbed herself off the bed and wrapped a sheet over herself. However, Butch would not stop. It's not what you think, he wasn't trying to force me to do anything. Her remarks caused me to hesitate for a little moment, and then I diverted her attention. Selena went into her presence like she was disgusted, and yeah, that is precisely what I said it is. Before she could utter another word, she was already speaking. Despite the fact that a storm was raging around her, she did not hesitate before passing her palm over Emily's face in a thunderous and stinging smack. After Emily had fallen to the ground, Selena spoke in a tone that was low and poisonous against her. You are going to submit a complaint against him right now. You pointed a finger at Emily, who stumbled back in shock. Emily shook her head and spoke in a shaky voice, saying, I can't, you can, and you always will. She was interrupted by Selena, who moved closer to her and said, if you don't, I swear I'll find enough narcotics in your car to put you in jail. Emily's face contorted into a frown as she glanced between Selena and me with tears in her eyes. Do you comprehend what I'm saying? I'm sorry, she mumbled, her voice barely audible due to the tears that were flowing down her face. Upon the arrival of more cops, the home was a whirlwind of commotion. The sound of sirens gradually diminished when the front door was opened. Noah walked in a tone that was calm but dominating as before, and behind him stood a person who was not alone. Rebecca, the wife of Alex, was the lady I recognized from the photographs that Brian had given me earlier. The change in her countenance occurred when she took in the situation, which consisted of Alex cuffing and bloodying Emily, who was also disheveled and holding the sheet. Before Becky's face became twisted with anger, you son of a tyrant, there was a minute of dense and heavy quiet surrounding her. The moment she sprang at Alex, she yelled, and no one moved to stop her as she rained punches on him with her fists, landing with all of her might. Alex attempted to spin away from the anger of a lady who had deceived him, but the handcuffs and his injuries rendered him powerless. Becky then took over. As she shifted her attention to Emily and you, she spit at you and moved closer to her, ruining her house. Becky immediately began slapping and scratching Emily, and her cries reverberated throughout the room. Emily had hardly had time to respond before Becky was on her. Emily made an effort to protect herself by yelling out, but no one, not even Selena, attempted to intervene. A woman who stood with her arms crossed and watched the event with an expression that was a mixture of delight and scorn. Becky eventually took a step back, her chest heaving with the effort of the situation, and she turned to Alex and said, "We're done, do you hear me, done? In the event that you ever consider coming near me or the children, I promise you that I will make your life a living hell. I will be filing for divorce." Noah gestured for Alex to come over, but Alex did not reply. Instead, he just lowered his head in despair. Alex was carried out of the door with his head still lowered, but I knew that it wasn't finished yet. The cops to take him away, and Alex was taken away. It was true that Emily was hunched over against the wall, with tears flowing down her cheeks and down her body. Notwithstanding my shivering, I gazed at her in a stony and uninterested manner. I could see that she was not going to comply with the allegations made against her. Eyes in the manner in which she clung to the shattered pieces of whatever connection she believed she still had with Alex as she portrayed him in her eyes. As the room started to empty, Noah put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We will do what we can." His voice remained firm as the room began to clear. I glanced to Emily, who was still sitting on the floor with her face down against the floor. The house had become quiet after the last of the cops had departed. Her eyes were filled with tears, and she was clinging to the sheet around her as if it might protect her from the reality that she had made as she stood up. She glanced up at me with her lips twitching as she began to speak, "Butch." Her voice was low, but it was chilly enough to make her flinch. I cut her off abruptly, "So please don't even attempt to explain yourself, I'm not going to explain anything to you." I took a step closer to her, looming over her, "And you have no right to defend any of this. I have my hands clenched at my sides to prevent myself from striking out. You are going to take the baby and go tonight, and I don't worry about it. Where you go, but you're not staying here, this home is mine, and you have nowhere to go." She was no longer interested in it, and her eyes widened as she shook her head and used a frantic voice. "Butch." As I bent down and met her eyes, I felt every ounce of rage and betrayal that I could possibly feel. "I am filing for divorce. Please allow me. In the event that you are considering a dispute with me about it, I want to make it quite clear that I have everything, including every single text, every single email, and every single phone call." I motioned around the room, despite the fact that it was a horrible little film, and I brought up your affair with Alex's wife, who was hammering the truth out. The whole incident, which included his being detained in my home, was videotaped, and she shed tears freely now, but I didn't care if you didn't sign those documents and went peacefully. I'll make everything public, and everyone will know about it. Know precisely who you are and what you've done. She attempted to get in touch with me, her voice breaking. I made a mistake. I was trying to reach out to her. The room was filled with the sound of my voice as I yelled out, "Stop. You don't get to play the victim here. You made your own decisions, and you deceived me. You have made your bed now, you have mistreated me, and you have ruined all that we had." As she sat there, dejected and crying into her hands, she let her hand fall to the ground and lay in it. Get out of there. That evening the knock on the door that evening was harsh, and the person who was standing up straightened up and pointed to the door. I opened it with deliberateness, and there was David standing there, his presence as dominating as it had always been, but with a solemn expression. His piercing eyes scanned the home like they were looking for something, and he strode inside without waiting for an invitation. I had not seen him before. As he was trying to piece together what had occurred here, he did not sit down until I did, and then he carefully lowered himself onto the chair opposite from me. During a little period of time, he just looked at me with his face seeming inscrutable, and then he said. When I learned about what had occurred, he stated it in a voice that was quite a little softer than I had anticipated. I did not answer since there was nothing. In order to express that, David bent forward, putting his elbows on his knees, and clasping his hands together. I won't make any excuses for her since she made her own decisions, and now she has to deal with them, but you should be aware of this. Not only did she leave us because she no longer wanted to be a part of our world, but she also left me speechless. I was completely taken aback by her departure. Clenched, but I could not speak anything. She had been connected with Alex even before David. Maintained his tone with a more forceful tone now that we discovered I had urged her to stop it, but she refused. I informed her that she was no longer required to be a part of my family. He stopped, his eyes becoming more gloomy. Because of his children, I didn't murder Alex back then, and I won't kill him now for the same reason, but I will make sure that he doesn't kill me. If you breathe another breath in this city, he will go, and he will not return. His wife has filed for divorce, and I will make sure that she gets a divorce. Alex is going to leave her with all he has, and those children are being cared for, or else he is going to regret it in ways that he cannot even begin to fathom. David rose up and straightened his suit jacket. As he glanced down at me, his demeanor became somewhat more kind, and a flicker appeared on his face. He added in a low voice, "At least I did a good job of raising my daughter." He was crossing his face with remorse. I believed that I had, but it's possible that my transgressions and my karma have now caught up with me via her. He then turned and headed to the door before leaving. Before leaving, he gave me a quick look, his eyes remaining steady. "If you ever need anything," he said, "I'm here for you. You know where to find me, Butch," and before you knew it, he was gone, leaving the weight of his words behind. 2 days have passed, and he has not been seen since. I was aware that it wouldn't continue for very long, and sure enough, by lunchtime, word circulated that Alex had been freed. The news arrived a little bit discreetly. Outside of the station, he was picked up by a vehicle that was dark and had tinted windows. After that, he vanished without a trace. As soon as I heard from him once again, Becky contacted me that evening. She seemed almost astonished as she informed me that Alex had returned. Since I have already completed the divorce papers and sent them back to her, everything is now in my name. She has said that the home and the accounts are in her name. Despite everything, her voice broke slightly. I don't know how it happened, but I am certain that this wasn't simply him having a sudden change of heart. As for Emily and the baby, they were no longer there, so I asked no questions since I didn't feel the need to. There was no farewell, no trace, and nothing else. It was as if she had disappeared overnight. A portion of me anticipated it, but the stillness continued to seem oppressive. I told myself that it was better this way, but the weight of everything was still too much to bear. When I had lingered, I got myself a drink and sat by myself in the peace and quiet of my home, allowing the night to consume me completely. Noah phoned me into his office. His tone indicated that there was no space for delay, and as I stepped in, I stopped cold. David was seated there already. Being calm and collected while holding Emily's kid in his arms, Noah felt the weight of the atmosphere. Made a motion for me to shut the door, and I did so despite the fact that every muscle in my body was tense with the assumption that Noah was missing Emily. Replied, his voice firm, but grim. "David has been trying to find her, but there is no trace of her wherever I looked. I have been looking everywhere." The expression on David's face was one of extreme serenity, and there was a hint of a sinister smirk that he wore. I walked closer to him and locked eyes with him. I said, "Is she still alive?" as I barely brushed his lips. Instead of flinching, David rose slowly and adjusted the position of his body. His voice was low but forceful. Although he was holding the infant in his arms, he said that the divorce will be finalized in a few years. I can provide you with the assurance that he stepped closer to the infant, raising it slightly, and his voice became more kind as he stared down at the youngster. With a tone that was chilling in its confidence, he stated, "I will not make any mistake without another word." While he moved away, he continued to speak. Left, leaving the weight of his presence and the consequences of his comments that remained unanswered behind him, I turned to Noah, who was still there. In an effort to make sense of all that had just occurred, he sat back in his chair and rubbed his temples before meeting with the other person. He stated it with a tone of resignation, "David is leaving the city, and he is going away from it." I raised an eyebrow in response to his assertions that he had finished with his business endeavors for good. Noah, who was suspicious, groaned. "We both know that someone else will replace the vacuum with someone else. There is always someone ready to take the place. We are only able to do what we can to keep a watch on whomever goes in and make sure that they do not become as intelligent or as reandrous as they were before." I gave a hesitant nod in response to David's remarks, which lingered in the air heavy with the sense of inevitability. "I'm still in the game despite all that's occurred, Emily Alex, and the weight of this new reality is beginning to settle in. It seems odd to think that it has been practically a lifetime since David and the mess with my personal life occurred, yet here I am continuing on the journey. Streets, still investigating the same crimes, and still wearing the badge. The only change is that I now have a team to deal with. The true team is comprised of individuals that I entrust with my life and who are there for me if things go wrong. It is no longer only a job. Since Anna, Brian, and Noah are all members of the same family, even the new men are not simply co-workers. They are the ones who have gone through the same thing as me. We have had our fair number of brushes with death, and I don't only mean the ones with criminals, occasionally the ones with the police. The most difficult conflicts are the ones that are not publicized, the late nights during which you are awakened by phone calls, and the periods when you are sleeping. You can hardly get a bite to eat before you have to go back out on the streets, but this squad, my team, they make it all tolerable. We're not going to let this happen. Faultless, but we are there for each other when it matters, and that is what made all the difference when I first started doing it. Was centered on demonstrating that I was capable of overcoming the system and demonstrating that I had what it required to live, but somewhere along the road, I realized that just surviving is not enough. You also need to have people who care about the people you care about. They call me a leader, but the truth is that I am not a leader. To tell you the truth, I wouldn't be where I am now if it weren't for them. Whenever I'm on the verge of snapping, one of them is there to draw me back. Every time I allow myself to get too engrossed in the din, one of them brings to my attention the fact that we are more than simply law enforcement officers. Dear listeners, I would appreciate it if you could express your ideas. We are a family, and maybe that is the one thing that I have finally gotten right. The space below for comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.